Hey there, everyone. That sexy nerd is back again, and I've been having some technical difficulties recently, so I feel like I owe you guys another video. And Extra History has been doing a couple of things, so yeah, Wu Zetian. I don't know. Maybe it's China's first empress. China is a weak spot for me. China, at least ancient China right now. I mean, I'm trying. Got me back into Dynasty Wars for anybody who's ever played that. Woo! I love that. I wish I could play them because a lot of my stuff is not compatible anymore. But I'm working on a solution. But anyway, I do like what's going on with China. I like learning about China. I finally been learning a little bit more about China, like the Taiping Rebellion, more about the Mongols. But Mongols are their own thing, kind of. How the West, the century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, all that good stuff. And this must be ancient China. So I've never heard of this lady. Let's just get into it. And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. By the way, everyone, I'm going to be doing both episodes that I've missed so far. So let's get into it.
Chang'an, China, 684.
Chang'an! The Battle of Chang'an from Dynasty Warriors. Or the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Fine.
Dowager Empress Wu orders the nervous messenger to read the letter aloud before the entire court. It's from a poet who has joined a rebellion against her. It describes and denounces Wu. It details how she rose from a low-level concubine to be the power behind the imperial throne, ruling through a series of puppet emperors. She used her fox-like charms to delude the emperor, he reads. She finally was able to put on an empress's clothes and put our emperor in a position of committing incest.
What?
She nods for him to continue. He does, shaking. She has a heart like a snake and a lizard, and a disposition similar to a wolf. She is close to insidious individuals and murders the faithful and the good. She killed her sister, slaughtered her brothers, murdered her emperor, and poisoned her mother. Both gods and men hate her, and heaven and earth cannot allow her to exist.
Really?
The throne room falls silent. Wu accepts the letter, scanning it. Then she laughs, and turning to her advisors, shoots them a look. "This is your fault," she says, waving the letter. "You should have hired him to work for us."
What?
Empress Wu Zetian, or Wu Zhao, to use the name she called herself, is one of the most fascinating and dramatic characters in world history.
Okay.
Entering the imperial court as a 14-year-old concubine, she began a meteoric rise through the ranks of the emperor's harem to capture the heart of the man's heir and rule as co-monarch through a series of weak emperors. There,
Really?
she served as a stable force amid changeable and often incompetent rulers, steering the Tang dynasty through the period of its greatest glory.
I know all this stuff. I mean, might have seemed cool, but China didn't see a lot of change until, after the century of humiliation. So maybe it wasn't all that bad. And she was probably there before the Mongols. Imagine. Oh, shit.
Administrative reforms and sponsorship of the new foreign religion of Buddhism permanently changed China and helped the dynasty endure another 200 years after her death. But her greatest achievement, what makes her so notable, is that she is the only woman in history to rule China not as a regent or through a weak monarch, but under her own name. And this was so unprecedented that there's actually no word for the role she took. See, the Chinese word for empress just means the emperor's wife. Wu Zhao, by contrast, is known as the female emperor, a state of affairs that some at the time considered against nature. In the 7th century, China was a land ruled by Confucianism. While the common people practiced Taoism, folk beliefs, and the newly arrived faith of Buddhism, the ruling class adhered to the teachings of Confucius, or Master Kong, a 6th century BCE scholar, whose name Jesuit missionaries later Latinized into Confucius. And the thing about Confucianism is that it had a hard lock on the minds of court officials. To serve the court was to be a Confucian scholar. It was the organizing principle of imperial power. That's significant, because Confucianism is a religion, or a moral system, or maybe a humanist philosophy. It's sort of hard to tell. Anyway, the important thing is that it's based in organizing society around hierarchical relationship. Fathers rank above sons, older siblings rank above younger ones, lords above vassals, etc. And crucially, wives were supposed to be quiet, obedient supporters of their husbands and yield control to adult sons. As a result, Empress Wu's time in power and her success as a ruler threatened the Confucian scholars who went on to write the official histories of her reign, which, as you can imagine, creates a problem for today's scholars, particularly since Chinese official histories weren't also really interested in recording truth. Rather, they were meant to be moral instructive narratives for future rulers. And the narrative they built around Wu was, "Oh, this is why you never let a woman have power." Histories of Wu villainize her as a monster, a treacherous plotter who manipulated her way into power via sex and assassination, then slaughtered her political opponents in mass executions, a vile usurper who killed off 12 lines of her own family tree. But many of those stories are likely exaggerated or even invented. The most infamous accusation, that she supposedly had her rivals' hands and feet lopped off before throwing them into a vat of wine to drown, oh yeah, don't worry, we'll get there in Ep 2, was clearly lifted from an earlier story. Of course, that doesn't mean that she was nice. The imperial court, including the harem, was a dangerous place. And Wu was a ruthless participant in its games of power, where intrigue, slander, assassination, sex, and outright murder all played a part in advancement. Of course, when used by male emperors, these were seen as just necessary tools of state that brought no dishonor. But the young girl who arrived at court in 637 was not yet familiar with these royal tools. Indeed, her bloodline was quite common. Her father was wealthy, a lumber merchant who by happenstance became friendly with a provincial officer who would later lead a rebellion, topple the Sui dynasty, and make himself emperor as the founder of the Tang dynasty. Wu's father likely assisted with that rebellion, since the new emperor made him a governor, granting him aristocratic status. Young Wu benefited from the liberal nature of the new dynasty, where roles for women were expanding. Because while Confucianism held women in a lesser role, it did also encourage female education, and Wu's father provided her with an unusually broad base in literature, rhetoric, music, and politics. Yet it was her looks that got her noticed. For at the age of 14, she won what has been called the largest beauty pageant ever conducted, the survey for the imperial harem, which meant that by Tang standards, she was very, very attractive. She went to the palace to serve Emperor Taizong, a man who had secured the throne by killing 2 of his brothers in a sword fight after one had poisoned him. Yet she would have to do more than look pretty. For while it is true that concubines, lesser wives of the emperor, existed to fulfill his sexual desires and produce children, they also did everything needed to maintain the emperor's personal quarters. Men were banned there, so the concubines worked in a sort of shadow bureaucracy, with 9 ranks divided by their role. The primary wife, the emperor consort, was on the first rank, the favorites on the second rank, and on down to concubines who helped with bathing, serving food, or as secretaries. Lady Wu was made a 5th rank concubine, essentially a chambermaid, responsible for changing Emperor Taizong's bed linen.
Do they all have sex with him, though?
Mid-ranking duty, but one with a certain hint at intimacy that her enemies would later make a great deal out of, suggesting that Wu was secretly Emperor Taizong's favorite. The truth was, as usual, a bit more complicated than that. Throughout her life, Wu would go back and forth on whether she and Taizong ever slept together, depending on what version was expedient at the time. Realistically, the 40-year-old Taizong probably slept with her a couple of times, as it was common, but according to Wu's own account later in life, he seemed to find her a little unnerving. Her big moment with him came one night as he relaxed with his concubines, discussing his favorite subject, his horses. Oh, Taizong loved his horses more than anything. They'd been his mounts as a young warrior, and he took more joy in them than even his own children.
Wow.
But there was one horse, a new one, which just couldn't be broken for riding. "I could break him," Wu said. "I would need 3 things, an iron whip, an iron mace, and a dagger." Amused, Taizong asked her how she would do it. "I will whip him," she said with ice in her voice. "If he does not submit, I will strike him in the head with a mace. If he still does not submit, I will take the dagger and slit his throat." According to Wu, Taizong was impressed by her fortitude, but probably not exactly turned on. 11 years into Wu's tenure at the palace, when Taizong was dying, she was still a 5th rank concubine, changing his sheets and nursing him in his final days. Not really a sign of good favor. Soon, Taisong would die, his body taken to the elaborate tomb made for him, its entrance flanked by enormous statues of his favorite horses. Wu and her fellow childless concubines would then enter a Buddhist nunnery where they would spend the rest of their lives praying for Taisong's soul. Except that a very special visitor came to the deathbed, Taisong's son, soon to be known as Emperor Gaozong, a 21-year-old who likely had grown up with a bit of a schoolboy crush on the beautiful Wu, who was 3 years his senior. But they could never be, as any relationship between them would have been considered incest. And yet, Wu really didn't want to go to that nunnery. After he used the toilet, Wu held out a bowl for him to wash his hands in. Once he'd finished, he flicked them dry, spraying water on her face. Perhaps an accident, perhaps a flirtation. But without missing a beat, she looked up to him and said, "I accept heaven's favor of rain and mist." Which is 17th century harem speak for, "Oh, I'm into it, kid. Let's do this."
Oh, God.
Chang'an, China, 649 CE. Once, Lady Wu lived in the palace. Once, she attended the emperor and flirted with the prince regent. Once, she was known as the Fair Flatterer, a nickname comparing her to a popular ballad. But now she sits in the Buddhist convent, her emperor dead, her hair shorn, and her life over. Her lover, the new emperor, had promised to send for her, but as she watches the leaves outside begin to curl and fall, she worries that she too will dry up and die here. She writes him a poem. "Watching red turn to green, my thoughts entangled and scattered, I am disheveled and torn from my longing for you, my lord." She dispatches it to the palace, and soon after, the Emperor Gaozong arrives to offer incense to the Buddha. But upon seeing each other, the two burst into tears, and the court begins to whisper. Within a year, Fair Flatterer Wu will be back at court, and the harem will descend into war. This meeting of Wu and Emperor Gaozong is the traditional story of how the two came back together, but there are reasons to doubt it. It's been pointed out, for example, that Buddhist nuns must shave their hair. Yet the record states that within a year of returning, Wu's hair had reached 7 feet long, suggesting she never cut it at all. Likewise, Buddhism was not yet a favored religion in the Confucian court, making Wu's exile there a strange aberration. Due to these inconsistencies, it's been suggested that the convent was actually a cover, a way to keep Wu close enough to the palace to visit, but also out of sight so Gaozong could carry on their affair in secret. Either way, someone else...
Did he have a wife? Oh, Jesus, that's messed up.
Out of sight, so Gaozong could carry on their affair in secret. Either way, someone else appeared to notice that the two were still attached. Gaozong's chief wife, Empress Wang. And in Wang, the Empress thought she found the perfect solution for a problem she was having. See, Empress Wang was a highborn, smart, and refined lady.
She goes very deep Wang.
I'm Wang. Deep Wang. Deep Wang.
God, I hate that movie!
A good wife for Gaozong, but she wasn't really a good match for him personally, and she didn't seem to be able to have children. This made her position incredibly precarious. Her main job was to provide an heir after all, and that wasn't happening. In fact, she was so worried about being demoted that she took the drastic step of adopting the children of lesser concubines to give herself legitimate heirs. But the biggest threat to Wang was from Gaozong's favorite concubine, pure consort Xiao. Not only was Xiao more beautiful and amenable than Wang, but she'd given the emperor 1 son and 2 daughters. Worse still, that son was a straight-up child prodigy, real crown prince material, and Xiao had riled up a court faction that was pressuring Gaozong to name her son his new heir. So in Wu, Empress Wang saw a weapon to break up this love triangle. Move Wu back to the palace, and Gaozong would spend all of his attention on her and forget about Xiao.
What? That's a very bad idea, man. Wow. That's like the worst idea I've ever heard in my life.
And since Wu had been Gaozong's father's concubine, and any union between them would be legally incestuous, Wu could never be promoted to replace Wang. Huh? Now, if you are sitting at home thinking this sounds like a horrible plan, well, that's because it was.
Literally said that.
Let's keep a few things in mind here. Firstly, these three, Gaozong, Empress Wang, and Xiao, all in their early 20s. So basically imagine them as a bunch of college juniors, and this plan's logic kind of makes a little more sense, right? A little bit, yeah. Second, they weren't used to palace intrigue. I mean, Gaozong was never even supposed to become emperor. He was the third soft son of Taizong, whose two older brothers were jockeying for the title of heir. But their rivalry became so intense that they'd both independently hatched plots to depose their father and gotten banished to remote border postings. And look, I know you'd like to hear about that as well, and honestly, you kind of should. Because, oh boy, that story is just full of the juiciest juicy juice.
Yes.
Like there's secret gay lovers, murder plots, and people dressing up as Turkic nomads. But if we stop this series and detail every subplot of palace intrigue, this series would last a lifetime.
What? Come on, don't blackball me like that.
AKA too much tea to spill. This is Imperial China after all. They have a lot of tea. Heck, they invented it. Getting back to the point though, both Wang and Xiao had joined Gaozong's harem when he was the third son. And now this high-pressure environment of plots and intrigue surrounding an emperor was very new to them. So Wu returned to the imperial harem as a handmaiden to Empress Wang, where the Empress could keep tabs on her and get FaceTime with the emperor when he saw his old favorite. And at first, it worked. Xiao's hold on Gaozong lessened as he became re-infatuated with Wu, showering her with gifts. But what Wang didn't realize was that Wu had already spent 11 years in the imperial harem, and in that time had learned to be quite the canny operator. For instance, instead of eating the sweets that Gaozong brought her, Wu shared them with the servants of the harem. Instead of eating and in that time had learned to be quite the canny operator. For instance, instead of eating the sweets that Gaozong brought her, Wu shared them with the servants of the harem. Rather than wear the fine jewelry he lowered around her neck, she used it to win the loyalty of other concubines or by influence among court factions. See, in their rivalry, both Wang and Xiao's popularity had dwindled in the harem. They'd become haughty and arrogant, treading rough on those beneath them. Wu, by contrast, used the emperor's gifts as a war chest to win allies and set up an intelligence network. Within a year, Wu had spies in every part of the harem and friends at court. After all, many of those high officials had sisters, nieces, and daughters who were also imperial concubines. Many were also from noble families connected to the two previous dynasties, who were currently on the outs now that the upper realms of the court were stacked by men who'd fought in the rebellion to establish the Tang. She targeted younger people, particularly those who had been dishonored, had something to prove, or that had a flaw that held them back. And gradually, she poisoned court opinion of both Wang and Xiao. Side note, she was almost continuously pregnant for those 3 years, having 2 sons, yet another disaster for Empress Wang, and a daughter. A daughter Gaozong was so excited to see, mind you, that upon her birth, Wu came to get him, and they went to meet the baby arm in arm. But as they approached the crib, they quickly realized something was wrong. The infant was too still to be sleeping. It was dead. Howling in agony, the bereaved parents asked the maid what had happened, to which she could only answer that the Empress had come for her formal visit to the child, and finding Wu absent, had played with the girl before leaving. Wu immediately accused Wang of poisoning the baby out of jealousy. Now, later tales speculated that Wu killed the child herself in order to frame Wang for its murder, but a far more likely explanation is that it simply was a tragic but not uncommon case of crib death that then Wu turned to her political advantage.
I think so.
Either way, the slander worked. Wang lost favor and was tainted by the scandal, while Gaozong began to talk openly about demoting Wang. At first, he discussed simply promoting Wu to a new rank of chief consort, which would sit between full empress and second-rank concubines, but soon he was discussing replacing the empress herself. But to do that, they would need the assent of the ministers, the old guard, Taizong's companions from the war, who still ran things. And man, oh man, did those guys distrust Wu, and quite frankly were disgusted with her background. So Wu turned up the heat, having the emperor host lavish dinners for them, where he plied them with gifts, and she activated her agents at court to bring more pressure. The break came when she enlisted an aristocrat known for being, to put it in mild terms, here it is, a sneaky little snaky snake. Cat Lee, he was called, the sword in the smile, both nicknames coming from his duplicitous nature. He was the one who openly proposed the change, but the ministers resisted until Wu delivered the coup de grace on both of her rivals. An agent told her that the Empress and consort Xiao, joining forces against a common threat, had been practicing witchcraft against her, sticking needles in dolls to try to kill her with Taoist spells. The use of such magic in the palace was a capital crime, considered as serious as the witchcraft against her. Sticking needles in dolls against a common threat had been practicing witchcraft against her, sticking needles in dolls to try to kill her with Taoist spells. The use of such magic in the palace was a capital crime, considered as serious as trying to stick the emperor and his chosen consort with real-life blades. And that was that. Empress Wang and Consort Xiao were stripped of their ranks and exiled deep into the palace.
Wow.
And 5 years after returning to court, Wu took the position as empress at Gaozong's side. And her rivals? Well, traditional accounts have it that Wu ordered their hands and feet chopped off and that they be thrown into a vat of wine. And supposedly as they drowned, she said something to the effect of, "Now those witches can get drunk to their bones." Of course, that's almost certainly a fabrication. The truth being not quite as fancy. Wu simply had them assassinated. Whether by poison, blade, or a forced suicide, she had done what Empress Wang had wished. Broken a love triangle once and for all. But they would not be the last rivals she had killed, because she had an empire to run. And as we're gonna find out next week, empires are lubricated with blood.
Yeah! Ooh. Oh, that was gross. Lubricated with blood. Should you have used that, buddy? Should you? Wow. Well, I'm hooked. Usually am at these things, though, and, God, I can't wait till the next episode. Maybe I should also do a little Ice Age. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do it. But let me know if you're enjoying these videos, and please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And I'll see you all in the next episode.